the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. I'm your host, Alison NIssen, and today I am lucky enough to have with me Kristen Durfee. Kristen, welcome to the Florida Writer Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Why don't you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Yeah, so I live in the Central Florida area. I've been a member of Florida Writers Association since I believe around 2015. So I write a little bit of everything. I have a young adult trilogy that's currently available right now called the Four Corners Trilogy. I also write short stories for adults in horror, comedy, thriller, and speculative fiction. And then I have an young adult contemporary book that's called Mass.
Sounds like you're a very busy writer.
Yes.
Did you always want to be a writer?
Pretty much. So I was a kid who struggled a lot with reading. So I didn't really learn how to read till I was about in third grade, which luckily it was caught by my teachers and my parents that they knew that I was kind of faking it. And so once, luckily I was able to be in a specialty program when I was in third grade and kind of caught myself up. And I think from that point on, the second that I knew how to read, I wanted to write. Immediately. And so I think kind of once I developed the one skill, the other one kind of followed pretty quickly in its wake. So yeah, I've pretty much been writing for pretty much my whole life.
That is awesome. I love the story of the struggle in the beginning because so many people do struggle and then they ignore it and then they can't rise above it.
Yes. Yeah. And it really was something, like I said, it's one of those where I was so glad it was recognized because I knew that I wasn't at the same level as my peers, but I didn't know quite how to articulate that, or get the help for it or what. So it's definitely something that, when I'm lucky enough to do school visits, obviously now virtual, but I do kind of try to, I try not to have my mom hat on too much in lecture. But I do tell the kids, I just know what it felt like to just feel dumb, how you just weren't cutting it and couldn't do it. And it's just so important to speak up, to your peers, to your friends, to your teachers, to anybody around you, to say that you need help. And that's something that I tried to carry through my life in general, of just, there's just no need to feel that way. There are people who are so eager to help. And I found that just as much as an adult in the writing community, that if you're struggling in anything, speak up, and there's going to be someone out there who's going to want to help you.
As a young reader, was there a specific author or genre that caught your attention?
Yeah, so I'm an 80s kid. And so I grew up, absolutely loving the Girl on the Face of the Milk Carton and The Girl Who Owned a City and those kinds of early dystopic, books, The Giver. And it's really something that even as an adult, some of my favorite books that have really stayed with me are books that I read when I was a teenager, and so that's something as a writer, I think it's just such a time of development in your life that when something makes an impact on you, it really stays. And so one of my favorite books when I was younger, that's still my absolute favorite book, is Watership Down by Richard Adams. And I read that every couple of years. And the older I get and the more I come back to it, it takes on new meaning and I discover new things about it and new depths. And I find that's kind of interesting too, to, look back at books that you liked when you were younger and see, as you get a little bit more experience in life, how it is coming back to it. But yeah, I just was I read whatever I could get my hands on pretty much when I was a kid.
So now that you are rereading books that were your favorite in childhood, are you reading them with the author's hat on? And so you're developing an eye for what they did that was successful and resonated with you?
Yeah, well, I think a little bit, because for me, I find kind of two things. Like I'm like my idea of like a great book is when I finish it, I go, oh my gosh, how do I do that? Like, how do I emulate this person, and all that. And it should also be without effort. So when I'm reading a really good book, I want to forget that I'm reading. And I feel like that's a mark of a really good writer, is when you get so engrossed in the story that you forget you're even reading a story. And so that's always a goal for me when I write, to just kind of have as immersive of an experience as I can. And I'm sure, since most of the people listening here are writers, I'm sure there's stuff that you read that you wrote 10 years ago and you're like, oh my gosh, how did I write something like that? I wish I could rewrite it or redo it, so I mean, it's a learning process always. But yeah, I mean, I do find sometimes that I try not to be very critical when I'm reading because it takes some of the fun out of it. So I try not to be like super analytical. But I do tend to acknowledge when someone just creates that magic and it's effortless and it works. I'm like, all right, this is like my case study. How do I do this?
And so how do you do that?
Oh gosh. So lots of editing. I very proudly write horrible first drafts. So don't be scared. Don't be scared of horrible first drafts. Don't talk yourself out of what you're doing. Just get it down and fix it later. That is like one of my mantras, is that you can't edit a blank page. So just get it down. But yeah, I'm like a very type A personality. So for me, having really extensive outlines is just kind of my method that I have found that has worked best for me. But I think writing kind of personifies your own personality. So if you are someone who likes lists and likes order and all that kind of stuff, I find it lends itself to that process also in writing.
So let's say you've written your really bad first draft and now you're sitting down to look at what you've done. So do you start with a solid plot and then you try to make sure that there's no plot holes, or do you just go through it and just try to throw in extra details?
Yeah, so I tend to kind of write lean first drafts. So I am definitely a plot driven writer. So for those kind of that are just starting out, there are people who there's typically two kind of like umbrellas, like plot driven and character driven. So people who have their storyline down, their beginning, middle, end, like they get everybody from point A to point B, which I do that, but then I forget that they all have feelings about the journey. So then I have to go back and add all that in, where there are some people that their characters are like super well developed. They have lots of feelings, but they like stumble along. So they need more help on the plot end, once they're done their stories. Like I said, and there's pluses and minuses for both. So it's certainly not one of those that I'm necessarily interested in having to fix that process for me, because I know I can get from point A to point B. And like I said, fix the feelings afterward. But since I know that this is a deficit that I have, and I know that through beta readers and critique partners, and all of that, I try now to make sure I add more of that. I still probably don't do it to the perfect level, which is why like the critique partners are so important. But because I do have my like plot all written out, and all that kind of stuff, usually my story movement is not typically where I need a lot. It's more of well, how does this person can I have some reflection, some of that? So I'll usually add between 10 and 20,000 words, where I know some writers are on the opposite end, where they write very, very long stories and they have to slash and burn. I don't think I've ever had a story that I've had to shorten before. It's pretty much always having to add stuff. And like I said, there's times where I like hearing other authors' processes and ones that edit as they go along and all this. And at times I wish my brain worked that way, because it sounds easier in some ways once you get to the editing process. But it also enables me to finish a draft. And for me, that's just as important. So figure if you end up with a book either way at the end, doesn't really matter how you get there.
No, it's always about the journey anyway.
Yes. Yeah, totally. For the characters and yourself. Sometimes we don't even know what's going to happen.
That's true, especially if the characters are talking to you. They're screaming, wait, I have a heartache right here. You're not developing me yet.
I know.
So what is the process you have? So you've written your first draft. Now you go through, and do you start immediately with beta readers, or do you go through and edit first and then you find your beta readers?
No, so, and this is, I mean, and I feel like I learn on every book that I've written. So I will have 4 books that are published, but I have 7 that I've completed. So there's a couple that are still kind of in the editing process, out on agents and stuff like that. So I feel like, but with every book, I learn something that helps me on the next one, both on the front end and the back end. Where now I try to do a little bit more research before I start writing, where I used to not do that as much. And then I would end up having to either stop in the middle of writing something because like I really need to know X, Y, and Z to move the story forward, or it would just take so much time on the edits on the end, so some of that I've definitely learned. I've learned to keep like really good character lists. As soon as I introduce a character, I try to write them down and any identifying features, just to help my future self out. But one of the big things that I do also, because I am someone who can like totally get lost on the internet, and I'm like Googling one thing and then I'm suddenly like shopping on Amazon and I like don't even know how I got here kind of thing. So to help myself, I always put, if it's further research that isn't necessary for me to know. So like, how long does it take to get from this particular city in Florida to this particular city in Florida? Like, I don't have to know that that's what's happening in my story. So instead of stopping my flow to Google that information, I'll just put in a bracket, look up how long it takes to get from point A to point B. So one of my first like rounds that I do is a search find for brackets. And I write down all of my things that I had to do research for. And so I'll take time, do all that research. I do a lot of writing on paper. So all of my like story Bibles and all of that are on paper. So I'll write that in that same notebook of like all of my like research stuff to then go back. And like I said, and so every time I do it, I learn a little bit more. So this last book that, so I just finished a book for last year's National Novel Writing Month that I'm in the process of editing. And so that one, I decided to read the whole thing through first without trying to make a lot of changes and all that, and just kind of seeing overall, how it works, because I've never done that before. I always edit as I go. And then sometimes, you might be at like chapter 15 and go, oh, I really need to do this. And then I totally forgotten that I did it in chapter 20. So sometimes my notes weren't as meaningful. So I've done that. So I would say by the time I let somebody else read it, I'm at a minimum of draft 6. But each of my drafts, like I said, kind of have a purpose. So that first one is my research. My second one is to go through and see, do I need to add some in these chapters? So I'll add content. And then I kind of go through and go, okay, where's my emotional journey going? And kind of try to have a little bit more of constraints for it. Because otherwise I'll sometimes just get too overwhelmed by the process. So that helps keep me kind of on task a bit. And then I also usually only give it to 1 or 2 readers at a time, because I've made that mistake before too, where I've sent it out to like all of my beta readers at the same time, but they're getting such an early draft that then once I fix stuff, now I don't have anyone left to send that draft to. So I have a couple of my critique partner kind of beta readers that are like really good with the developmental type stuff. So I'll usually give it to them first, where they're like fantastic at like the big picture stuff, continuity stuff. And then once I make those bigger fixes, then I'll give it to the people who are a little bit better, again, with like the emotion and like that kind of stuff. So that by the time, my last person I have, it's usually just like, this all works, right? I can start submitting it. So I have rounds of people that I give it to also.
I love your process. I really, really do. I've been enjoying this conversation.
Oh, thank
Kristen,
you.
How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, so just Kristen Durfee. My Facebook is Kristen Durfee Author, and then also just KristenDurfee.com.
All right. Now, Kristen, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
I think so. I have my workout gear on. You guys can't see me, but I'm pumped. I'm ready.
All right. What is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Oh, my favorite guilty pleasure. Probably like trash TV. Whatever that is. Reality stuff, Food Network marathons, House Hunter marathon, just mindless television.
I'm all about the mindless television. Would you eat raw cookie dough?
I have, and I live to tell the tale.
There you go. It's to make your 12-year-old self happy.
Now that I'm an adult, I can do whatever I want. Yes.
That's right. That's right. You will not grow hair on your chest because of that. And what is the most sensible thing you own?
Oh gosh. This is a really hard question. Probably like a washer and a dryer. I don't know. I feel like that's very adult, and it would be not good if I probably didn't have one of those. I have a 4-year-old, so I do a lot of laundry.
Yes, Kristen Durfee, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
You all have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison NIssen. Alison out. Boom, we're all done.
Yay. Oh, that was fun.
It was fun. It was easy. So we stayed on task. Perfect.
We did. I'm proud of us.
Kristen Durfee grew up in Philadelphia, where an internal struggle with reading blossomed into a love of the written word. She writes the YA Fantasy Four Corners trilogy, as well as short stories, which appear in several thriller, speculative, and contemporary anthologies for adults. Her newest book, Mass, is published by Orange Blossom Publishing and will be available in March 2021. For more information about Kristen, visit her website at KristenDurfee.com. For more information on the Florida Writers Association, visit us on the web at floridawriters.org.